43 years, 15,695 days. That's how long Kevin Strickland spent behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. When the door of his prison cell slammed shut, Jimmy Carter was in office, Star Wars was playing in theaters, and cell phones didn't even exist yet. When that door finally opened, the world had changed beyond recognition. But the price of that freedom was staggering. They took everything from Kevin, his youth, his family, his mother, who died without ever seeing him come home. This story isn't just about a miscarriage of justice. It's about how a system designed to protect the innocent can grind a human life to dust and not even notice. The evening of April 25th, 1978, Kansas City, Missouri. A quiet neighborhood on South Benton Avenue, house number 6934. An ordinary evening in an ordinary home where a group of young people had gathered. 22-year-old Sherry Black, 21-year-old Larry Ingram, 20-year-old John Walker, and Ingram's girlfriend Cynthia Douglas. They were talking, hanging out together. None of them had any idea that within minutes a tragedy would unfold in that house, one whose consequences would stretch across decades. Suddenly, a group of armed men burst into the home, at least 3 attackers. They were aggressive, brutal, and deliberate. Later, investigators would establish the motive. One of the attackers, Kilm Adkins, believed Larry Ingram had cheated him in a dice game and decided to get his money back by force. But what started as a dispute over a gambling debt quickly spiraled out of control. The attackers tied up all 4 of them. Then they opened fire. Sherry Black, Larry Ingram, and John Walker were killed on the spot. They were 20, 21, and 22 years old. 3 young lives cut short in an instant. Cynthia Douglas was shot in the leg, but somehow survived. When the gunfire stopped and the attackers left, she played dead. She lay there motionless and waited. Once she was sure the killers had left the house, she crawled outside and called for help. Cynthia Douglas became the sole witness to a triple homicide, the only living person who could point to the killers, and it was her testimony that set off a chain of events that would destroy the life of a completely innocent man. The Kansas City police launched their investigation immediately. A triple murder is always a high-profile case that demands fast results. Detectives questioned Cynthia Douglas at the hospital. She had been through an unimaginable ordeal. She'd watched her friends get gunned down, taken a bullet herself, and played dead to survive. Her psychological state was extremely fragile, and it was in that condition that she was shown photos of suspects for identification. Fairly quickly, investigators zeroed in on 2 actual participants in the attack, Kilm Adkins and Vincent Bell. Both were arrested, and both eventually admitted their guilt. But the police needed a 3rd suspect. There had been at least 3 attackers, and detectives were looking for one more accomplice. And that's when the name Kevin Strickland entered the picture, an 18-year-old black man from Kansas City. He wasn't even 19 at the time of the crime. According to his own account, on the evening of April 25th, he was at home watching TV and talking on the phone. A typical evening for a typical teenager. But the morning after the murders, police were already knocking on his door. How exactly Strickland's name ended up on investigators' radar is a question that was never definitively answered. But what happened next is well documented. Cynthia Douglas was shown a photograph of Strickland, and this is where the most terrifying part of the story begins. Years later, Cynthia would reveal that detectives had pressured her. She described it this way. The officers told her, "Just point to Strickland in the lineup and we'll wrap this up. It'll all be over, you won't have to worry about these guys anymore." A traumatized, frightened young woman who had just barely survived a shooting did what they asked. She pointed to Kevin Strickland. That was the only thing linking Strickland to the crime. There were no fingerprints, no DNA evidence, no murder weapon, no testimony from other witnesses. In fact, a fingerprint found on the shotgun used in the killings belonged to a completely different person. Neither Adkins nor Bell named Strickland as one of the attackers. They pointed to someone else as the 3rd accomplice. But the police and prosecution had already made up their minds. The first trial of Kevin Strickland took place in the fall of 1978 in the Jackson County Circuit Court. The prosecution built its entire case on the testimony of a single witness, Cynthia Douglas. No physical evidence, no material proof was presented. The defense pointed to Strickland's alibi and the total absence of any tangible evidence tying him to the crime. The jury deliberated for several days. In the end, they couldn't reach a unanimous decision. The vote split 11-1. 11 jurors voted to convict, 1 voted against. That lone dissenter was a black juror, the only person of color on the panel. He refused to find Strickland guilty. A mistrial was declared due to the inability to reach a verdict. What happened after the mistrial speaks volumes. According to Strickland himself, after the trial, the prosecutor approached his attorney and said something that would be seared into his memory forever. "I'll make sure that doesn't happen again next time." What exactly did the prosecutor mean? The answer became clear at the second trial. The second trial took place in 1979, and here the prosecutor employed a tactic that is horrifying even decades later. He used all of his peremptory challenges, the right to dismiss potential jurors without giving a reason, to strike every single black candidate from the jury pool, every one, without exception. As a result, the second trial of Kevin Strickland, a 19-year-old black man from Kansas City, was held before an entirely white jury. The entire case once again rested on the testimony of Cynthia Douglas, the very same testimony that, as she would later admit, was given under police pressure. No new evidence was introduced. There was still no physical proof. But this time, the outcome was different. The all-white jury found Kevin Strickland guilty on 1 count of first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances and 2 counts of second-degree murder. The sentence: life in prison with no possibility of parole for 50 years. Kevin Strickland was 19 years old. He stood in that courtroom and listened to a sentence that meant he wouldn't walk free until he was 69, if he ever walked free at all, for a crime he didn't commit. And now, here's the detail that makes this story even more monstrous. Kilm Adkins and Vincent Bell, the 2 men who actually took part in the triple murder and admitted their guilt, struck plea deals with prosecutors. Each of them ended up serving roughly 10 years before being released. The actual killers, less than 10 years. An innocent man, 43 years. That math just doesn't add up. The years kept passing. Kevin Strickland spent his 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s in prison. He watched the world beyond the walls change through prison TV screens. The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed. Computers appeared, then the internet, then smartphones. He watched presidents come and go. Carter, Reagan, Bush Sr., Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, Trump, Biden. 8 presidents came and went while an innocent man sat in a prison cell. Over those decades, Strickland lost almost everything that connected him to the outside world. Friends disappeared, relatives grew old and passed away one by one. But he kept insisting on his innocence. Every year, every month, every day. He never admitted guilt, never apologized for something he didn't do. That stance, by the way, meant he couldn't be granted parole, since parole typically requires an admission of guilt and remorse. The system was punishing him for telling the truth. Meanwhile, Cynthia Douglas was living with her secret. The woman whose testimony had sent an innocent man to prison couldn't find peace. As early as 2009, 30 years after the trial, she tried to recant her testimony. She sent an email to the Midwest Innocence Project, an organization that specializes in helping the wrongfully convicted. In that email, she told the truth about what had happened, how the detectives pressured her, how they made her point to Strickland. Cynthia spoke about her remorse to friends and family members. She repeatedly tried to get the case reopened, but the wheels of justice turned slowly, and in Strickland's case, they didn't turn at all. Missouri law at the time didn't provide an effective mechanism for overturning convictions based on a witness recantation. The system was built to uphold guilty verdicts, not to revisit them. In 2015, Cynthia Douglas passed away after a prolonged illness. She never lived to see the release of the man her testimony had put in prison. The sole witness, the only person whose words had formed the foundation of the entire prosecution, died without ever achieving justice for Kevin Strickland. But her recantation was on record, in emails, in conversations with loved ones, in appeals to advocacy organizations. You'd think that after the death of the sole witness who had recanted her testimony, the case would fall apart. But no. Another 6 long years passed before the gears of justice slowly began to turn in the other direction. The turning point came in 2021. In April of that year, the Missouri State Legislature passed a new law that finally allowed local prosecutors to file motions for the release of inmates they believed had been wrongfully convicted. Before that moment, prosecutors simply had no legal mechanism to reopen such cases. The law changed the game. Jackson County prosecutor Jean Peters Baker became the first prosecutor in Missouri history to use the new law. In May of 2021, she publicly declared that Strickland had been wrongfully convicted, calling his case a profound error. In August, she filed a formal motion to vacate the conviction. In her motion, Peters Baker pointed to three key factors. First, the sole witness had repeatedly and consistently recanted her testimony up until her death. Second, there was not a single piece of physical evidence linking Strickland to the crime scene. Third, the prosecutor at the second trial had deliberately struck every black juror, creating an all-white jury to try a black defendant. But even after the county prosecutor, the person representing the state, declared Strickland innocent, the system continued to resist. Enter Missouri Attorney General Eric Schmitt. His office opposed Strickland's release. Schmitt maintained that Strickland was guilty and should remain in prison. The Attorney General's office launched a series of legal maneuvers designed to block or at least drag out the release process as long as possible. Schmitt's team secured at least 2 postponements of the innocence hearing. They demanded that all Jackson County judges be recused, arguing that the presiding judge had allegedly expressed a biased opinion about the defendant's innocence. They even demanded that the case be renamed from State of Missouri versus Kevin Strickland to State of Missouri versus Jean Peters Baker, attempting to discredit the prosecutor's motion. While lawyers argued and the bureaucratic machine chewed through months, a tragedy struck, one that became the most devastating blow Kevin Strickland suffered in all 43 years of his imprisonment. On August 21, 2021, Rosetta Thornton died, Kevin Strickland's mother. She didn't make it. Her entire life, she had believed in her son's innocence. She had waited for him to come home. And she died while the state attorney general played legal games, blocking the release of a man whose innocence was plain for all to see. Kevin Strickland couldn't say goodbye to his mother. He wasn't allowed to attend her funeral. He learned of her death in his prison cell, the same place where he'd spent most of his life for someone else's crime. He would later say, "Knowing that my mother is in the ground and I didn't get to see her in her final years. I cried the same tears I cried when they told me I was guilty of a crime I didn't commit." Strickland's family was devastated. Instead of mourning their mother together, instead of being there for each other, they were kept apart, because the state kept insisting on the guilt of a man whom everyone, including the prosecutor herself, believed to be innocent. Finally, on November 23, 2021, 3 months after his mother's death, the decisive hearing took place. Judge James Welsh reviewed all the evidence, the witness's recantation, the absence of physical proof, the testimony of the actual perpetrators who said Strickland wasn't with them, and the racial discrimination in jury selection. The judge's ruling was unequivocal. Welsh ordered the conviction vacated, stating that the guilty verdict had not been based on physical evidence, but had rested solely on the testimony of a witness who subsequently recanted. The judge noted the numerous and consistent recantations and found that Strickland had been wrongfully convicted. Kevin Strickland was released that same day. He was 62 years old. He had entered prison as an 18-year-old teenager. He walked out an elderly man in failing health, needing a walker to get around. Between those 2 moments lay 43 years, the longest confirmed wrongful imprisonment in Missouri history, and one of the longest in the history of the United States. The first thing Kevin Strickland did after his release was visit his mother's grave. He stood over the fresh headstone and wept. The world around him had changed so much it was unrecognizable, but the pain of loss was eternal and timeless. After his release, Strickland ran headfirst into a cruel irony of the American legal system. The state of Missouri, which had stolen 43 years of his life, didn't pay him a single cent in compensation. Under state law, financial compensation for wrongful conviction was only available in cases where the exoneration was based on DNA evidence. Strickland's case had been overturned based on a witness recantation, which meant it technically didn't qualify under the compensation statute. A man who had spent 43 years behind bars for someone else's crime walked out into freedom with literally nothing. No money, no housing, no health insurance, no support whatsoever from the government that had taken his entire life. But the public responded differently than the government. Strickland's story sparked a wave of sympathy across America. The Midwest Innocence Project, which had fought for his release for years, launched a fundraiser on GoFundMe. Within days, people from across the country raised over $1,700,000. Complete strangers donated $5, $10, $50, because they understood that the government wouldn't do what it was obligated to do. Adjusting to life on the outside wasn't easy. 43 years in a confined space isn't just lost time. It's an entirely different life experience that reshapes a person from the inside out. Strickland didn't know modern technology and couldn't use many things that others took for granted. The world he returned to had nothing in common with the world he had left behind in 1978. But Kevin Strickland turned out to be a man of extraordinary resilience. He underwent several surgeries to regain mobility, gradually moving from a wheelchair to a walker, and then to a cane. He found a job, working at a local marina. He'd dreamed his whole life of seeing the ocean, and he finally made the trip to Miami with Ricky Kidd, another wrongfully convicted man who had become his friend. He found solace in fishing, a simple pastime that had been out of reach for nearly half a century. In June of 2022, the Kansas City Council passed a resolution declaring June 7th, Kevin Strickland's birthday, a day in his honor, a symbolic gesture that obviously can't compensate for 43 stolen years, but one that at least acknowledges what happened. A year after his release, Strickland gave interviews about what it's like to learn how to live all over again. He spoke of gratitude toward the people who helped him, and of a pain that will never fully go away. 43 years isn't a wound that heals, it's a scar that stays forever. Kevin Strickland's story isn't just one tragic fate. It's an indictment of the system, pressuring a traumatized witness, ignoring evidence that pointed to someone else, deliberately excluding every black juror from the panel, actively fighting against reopening the case even after the county prosecutor admitted the mistake, and a compensation law so narrow that a man who served 43 years for someone else's crime didn't receive a single dollar from the government, because he was exonerated the wrong way. Now think about this. The actual killers cut deals with prosecutors, admitted guilt, and walked free after serving about 10 years. Kevin Strickland, who committed no crime and refused to lie about his guilt, spent more than 4 times as long in prison. The system rewarded those who killed and punished the one who told the truth. Strickland's case became the first to be reviewed under Missouri's new law, granting prosecutors the right to seek conviction reversals. That precedent opened the door for other wrongfully convicted people in the state, but the very fact that it took a special law, passed in 2021, says everything. Until that point, until 2021, a prosecutor in Missouri simply had no legal way to secure the release of someone they believed to be innocent. The system didn't allow for it. It was designed to keep people in prison, not to let them out. Prosecutor Jean Peters Baker later called Attorney General Schmidt's actions prosecutorial malpractice. Schmidt, by the way, was later elected to the United States Senate. The man who fought to keep an innocent person behind bars got a promotion. That's American politics for you. Kevin Strickland once said, "I'm losing faith in the system." Those words sound like a verdict, not against him, but against the justice system that was supposed to protect him. He wasn't at his relatives' weddings. He didn't hold his dying mother's hand. He didn't watch the world change around him, only through a prison window and a TV screen in the common room. And when they finally set him free, the government said, "Sorry, you don't qualify for compensation." But 43 years in prison for someone else's crime didn't break him. He didn't give up. He didn't admit guilt just to get out early. He never stopped fighting. And when the world finally acknowledged his innocence, he didn't grow bitter. He visited his mother's grave, found a job, and started living again. At 62 years old, from scratch. One false identification, one biased prosecutor, one all-white jury, and 43 years behind bars. Kevin Strickland paid for someone else's crime with the highest price a living person can pay. You can't rewind time. You can only try to live whatever's left. And Kevin Strickland is trying, every single day, no matter what. Imagine this. You're 24 years old. You live in the Bronx, you work, You make plans for the future. One night, the police knock on your door. They grab you, twist your arms behind your back, throw you in a cell. A detective slams you against a table, threatens you. They tell you that you committed a terrible crime. You scream that it's a mistake, that you're innocent. But nobody listens. Then comes the trial, the verdict, and 25 years behind bars. A quarter of a century. For a crime committed by someone else, someone they never even looked for. This isn't the plot of a movie. This is the real story of Rafael Ruiz from New York City. A story in which a broken justice system ground up an innocent man and spit him back out decades later, when the best years of his life were gone forever. Rafael Ruiz was born around 1960 and grew up in the Bronx, one of New York City's most troubled neighborhoods. Latino by heritage, Rafael was part of the vast Puerto Rican community that had shaped the cultural identity of this borough for decades. He had a big family, brothers, sisters, a mother he adored. Among those closest to him was his sister Maria. She would become his greatest pillar of support during the dark years that lay ahead. The Bronx of the 80s was a world unto itself, a borough that in the 70s had literally been on fire. Arson, crumbling buildings, drugs on every corner. By the mid-80s, things had started to improve slightly, but crime remained catastrophic. New York in those years was living through a genuine epidemic of violence. Crack cocaine flooded the streets, gangs carved up territories, and the police, overworked and often corrupt, frequently took the path of least resistance. Find a suspect, any suspect, and close the case. In this atmosphere of fear and chaos, a person's life could be turned upside down in a single night, and that's exactly what happened to Rafael Ruiz. On April 18, 1984, in the Robert Wagner Houses, a public housing complex in East Harlem, Manhattan, a brutal crime took place. An 18-year-old woman, referred to in court documents by the initials B.F., was lured to the rooftop of one of the buildings by a man she knew as Ronnie. On the roof, others were already waiting. Several men, at least 3, attacked her. The young woman was beaten, robbed, and sexually assaulted. By some miracle, she managed to break free and escape. It was a horrific crime that demanded a thorough investigation. Police arrived at the scene, evidence was collected, including a sexual assault evidence kit, a so-called rape kit. The victim gave a statement. She described the attackers and said the main one went by the name Ronnie. Not a close acquaintance, more like a name she'd heard around the neighborhood. All of the attackers, she said, were black men. You'd think the police had enough to work with. The victim knew one attacker's name, Ronnie. She could point to the building, the floor, the apartment. Physical evidence had been collected. All they needed to do was conduct an honest investigation. Check the residents of that floor, find a man named Ronnie, match the description to real people, test the collected samples. But the police took a different path. In May of 1984, roughly a month after the crime, 24-year-old Rafael Ruiz was arrested. How exactly the police connected a Latino man from the Bronx to a case in East Harlem remains unclear. The case files offer no explanation for this link, and none of the available sources reveal why Ruiz came to the attention of investigators. A detective named Bickel conducted a photo identification, a procedure that would later become the centerpiece of this case and a textbook example of how not to run an investigation. Bickel prepared a photo array, a lineup of 6 photographs, one of which was Ruiz's. The problem started right here, and any competent investigator would call them egregious. First, the background on Ruiz's photograph was different from the backgrounds of the other photos. His picture literally stood out from the rest. Second, the faces in the other photographs were larger than Ruiz's face, creating a visual imbalance. Third, and this is perhaps the most astonishing part, all 5 other men in the photos had Afro-style hairstyles. Yet the victim had never said that Ronnie had such a hairstyle. Ruiz was the only one whose hair even remotely matched the description. But that's not all. The victim had clearly stated that all of the attackers were black. Rafael Ruiz is Latino. The 5 filler subjects in the photo array were black, and Ruiz was the only Latino. When this was pointed out in court, Detective Bickel responded that he had believed some of them might also be Latino, but he would have had to look at their last names to determine ethnicity. That kind of answer from a professional investigator sounds, to put it mildly, unconvincing. The photo identification was conducted around 2 in the morning. The victim pointed to Ruiz. Then, immediately after, another procedure was carried out, a so-called show-up. The victim was shown the detained Ruiz in person, one-on-one. He was wearing the same clothes as in the photograph. Unsurprisingly, the victim identified him again, right after she had just seen his photo. Ruiz's defense attorney later challenged both identification procedures, calling them impermissibly suggestive. Even the judge acknowledged that the photo array was suggestive and that the show-up wasn't much better, but the judge still ruled the identification admissible on the grounds that the victim supposedly knew her attacker from before. That ruling became one of those legal turning points that sealed Rafael's fate for the next 25 years. What happened at the police station after the arrest is another dark chapter in this story. According to Ruiz himself, 2 detectives, including Bickel, used physical force against him. They twisted his arm, slammed him into a table, hurled slurs at him, and threatened him with violence. On the way to the holding cell, Bickel shoved him roughly. Rafael screamed that he was innocent, that he wasn't the right person, that he had never been on that rooftop, that nobody called him Ronnie, that he didn't even know how to drive, and the victim had mentioned that Ronnie gave her a ride in a car. But his words shattered against the walls of that interrogation room like waves against rock. Before the trial, the prosecution offered Ruiz a deal: plead guilty in exchange for a sentence of 1.5 to 3 years in prison. For many defendants, especially those who are poor and can't afford a good lawyer, an offer like that sounds like a lifeline. 1.5 years, and you're free. Admit to something you didn't do, and you can get back to your life. But Rafael Ruiz refused. He refused because he was innocent. He believed the truth would prevail, that the court would sort things out, that 12 jurors couldn't possibly convict an innocent man. It was a naive belief, and it cost him everything. On February 27, 1985, in the Supreme Court of New York County, Rafael Ruiz was found guilty on all charges: sexual assault, robbery, and other serious offenses. The sentence, 8 1/3 to 25 years in prison. Instead of 1.5 years under the deal, 25 years. Instead of a quick return to life, a quarter-century behind bars. This phenomenon in American justice is known as the trial penalty. When a defendant who dares to maintain their innocence and go to trial receives a disproportionately harsher sentence than what was offered in the plea deal. The system punishes people for exercising their constitutional right to a trial. Rafael was 24 years old when the prison gates closed behind him. Ahead lay an endless string of identical days that folded into months, months into years, years into decades. The world beyond the prison walls was changing at dizzying speed. Cell phones appeared, then the internet, then social media. The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed. Presidents came and went, and Rafael Ruiz sat in his cell, counting down the days until his next parole board hearing. Those hearings became a form of torture all their own. In the American prison system, there's an unspoken but well-known rule. To be granted parole, an inmate must demonstrate remorse, admit guilt, show that they understand the gravity of their crime. For those who actually committed a crime, it's a reasonable requirement. But for an innocent person, it's a trap. Either lie, admit to something you didn't do, and get a chance at freedom, or tell the truth and stay behind bars. Rafael Ruiz appeared before the parole board 9 times during his incarceration. He first became eligible for parole in August of 1992, 8 years after his arrest. But every time the board asked him about the crime, he gave the same answer: "I didn't do it, I'm innocent, it's a mistake." And every time, he was denied. 7 or 8 times in a row, he stood before the board and refused to lie. The years passed, and he kept insisting on his innocence, fully aware of what it was costing him. Each denial meant several more years in prison. Each time, he made a choice between freedom and truth, and he chose truth. But once, just once, he broke. His mother was gravely ill with cancer and dying. Rafael desperately wanted to see her, to hold her, to tell her he loved her. And in an act of pure desperation, at one of the hearings, he did what he had refused to do for years. He admitted involvement in the crime, not because it was true, but because he wanted to see his mother before she was gone forever. Available sources do not report whether Rafael managed to see his mother before she died. That question remains unanswered, like many other details of his story, swallowed by the bureaucratic machine. But the very fact that an innocent man, cornered by a cruel system, was forced to falsely incriminate himself just for the chance to say goodbye to his dying mother, that is not justice. That is institutional cruelty wrapped in a modern package. On April 28, 2009, after serving his full sentence, 25 years, Rafael Ruiz was finally released. He was around 49 years old. He had spent exactly as much time behind bars as he had spent free. Half his life had been stolen, but freedom turned out to be bitter. Rafael walked out with the label of a registered sex offender. That label in America is practically a sentence to civic death. His name, photograph, and address were publicly available in the sex offender registry. He was prohibited from living near schools or playgrounds. Potential employers, running background checks, saw a rape conviction and slammed the door. Landlords refused him housing. Little is known about exactly how Rafael lived during those 11 years of freedom. His story didn't make headlines until the fight to overturn his conviction began. What is known is that he scraped by on odd jobs, cleaning, minor repairs, all unofficial, no contracts, cash only. He lived with his sister, Maria, in the Bronx. The world he had returned to was foreign, technology he didn't understand, social norms that had shifted. A city he no longer recognized. A quarter century behind bars doesn't leave you unscathed. Prison breaks people, strips away social skills, creates psychological wounds that haunt you for years. At some point, Rafael began using drugs. Heroin, cocaine, a chemical escape from a reality that turned out to be no less cruel than prison. It's a tragically common story among former inmates, especially those who were wrongfully convicted. The world that was supposed to give them a second chance proves so hostile that self-destruction becomes the only way to cope with the pain. But running parallel to Rafael's descent into that abyss was another story. The story of a fight for his name, led by people who believed in his innocence. It all started back in 2003, when the Ruiz family reached out to William Tendy, a former Manhattan prosecutor who by then was working as a defense attorney. Tendy agreed to take the case pro bono. Together with a private investigator, they worked on the Ruiz case for 3 years, without a fee, driven purely by conviction and a belief in justice. And Tendy found what the police hadn't bothered to look for back in 1984. He discovered an alternative suspect, a man who lived in the same building, on the same 16th floor where the crime took place. This person was known to neighbors as an aggressive man with a history of violence against women. He matched the description given by the victim, and, here's the key part, his name was Ronnie. Tendy concluded that the victim had pointed to the wrong apartment on the 16th floor. The real Ronnie lived literally across the hall, opposite the door the victim had indicated. Back in 1984, the police never checked the neighboring apartments, never interviewed the residents of that floor, never asked whether someone named Ronnie lived nearby. They grabbed the first person a finger pointed at and closed the case. Tendy's discovery was remarkable, but it wasn't enough to overturn the conviction. They needed irrefutable scientific evidence. And that's when an organization entered the picture that has become, over the past few decades, a symbol of the fight against wrongful convictions in America, the Innocence Project. Back in 2006, the Innocence Project asked the district attorney's office to help locate the physical evidence in the case. Above all, the sexual assault evidence kit that had been collected on the night of the crime. But the search came up empty. The rape kit had seemingly vanished, lost somewhere in the bowels of the bureaucratic evidence storage system. It's worth pausing here to talk about a problem that is a national disgrace in America. The hundreds of thousands of untested rape kits, all across the country, in police storage facilities, kits containing biological samples collected from sexual assault victims, have sat for decades without anyone ever sending them for DNA analysis. Hundreds of thousands of them. In some cities, storage rooms were discovered containing tens of thousands of untested kits. Each one of those kits represents a potentially unsolved crime, or, as in the case of Ruiz, an innocent person behind bars. Years passed. The first attempt to find the rape kit in 2006 was unsuccessful, and the case essentially stalled. Ruiz served his full sentence and was released in 2009. For nearly a decade after the failed evidence search, nothing changed. The bureaucratic machine moved with its usual sluggishness. But the attorneys at the Innocence Project didn't give up. In 2017, the organization's lawyer, Seema Saifi, reached out to the Conviction Review Unit at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, asking them to join a reinvestigation of the Ruiz case. This time, the prosecution agreed. And then, the seemingly impossible happened. The rape kit was found. More than 30 years after the crime, the evidence kit containing biological samples, which had been gathering dust on some shelf in a police storage facility all that time, was finally located and sent for DNA testing. The results were unequivocal and devastating. From the biological samples, a single male DNA profile was extracted. One and the same man had left traces on all the samples. And that man was not Rafael Ruiz. The DNA analysis completely excluded Ruiz as the source of all tested specimens. 35 years. That's how long that kit sat untested. If it had been tested in 1984, or even in the 90s when DNA technology became available to law enforcement, Rafael Ruiz would not have spent a single day in prison. But it wasn't tested. Not because they couldn't, because they didn't think it was necessary. On January 28, 2020, 35 years after the verdict was handed down, in the courtroom of the New York State Supreme Court, what Rafael Ruiz had been waiting for, his entire conscious life, finally happened. Judge Stephen Antignani reviewed a joint motion from the prosecution and the Innocence Project to vacate the conviction. The prosecution, the very same institution that had once secured his conviction, was now admitting that a mistake had been made. The judge granted the motion. All charges against Rafael Ruiz were dismissed. The conviction was vacated. Decades of stigma, 25 years behind bars, years of humiliation as a registered sex offender. All of it was declared the result of a catastrophic miscarriage of justice. Rafael was around 60 years old that day. When the judge spoke the words vacating the conviction, his sister Maria was in the courtroom. She wept. Later, Maria would tell reporters, "I feel like I've been born again and can start over with my brother." All those years, she had been waiting for this day. She believed in his innocence, supported him, helped him, never gave up. The Innocence Project posted photos from the exoneration ceremony. They were picked up by every major news outlet in America. In the images, an elderly man with weary eyes embraces his loved ones and, for the first time in decades, smiles without a trace of fear. After his exoneration, Rafael gave an interview to the Associated Press. His words were simple and bitter. "I'm free, but I'm broke, and I can't find a job." In that short sentence lies the entire truth about life after a wrongful conviction. Legal vindication doesn't give back the lost years. It doesn't heal the trauma. It doesn't provide a career. It doesn't compensate for a stolen youth. The Ruiz case attracted enormous media attention. The Washington Post, NBC News, ABC News, the New York Post, all the major outlets wrote about the man who was exonerated by a rape kit that had sat untested for decades. His story contained everything that can go wrong in American justice: a suggestive identification, untested evidence, pressure on an innocent person, and a system that punishes those who dare to defend themselves. And what about the real perpetrator? That same Ronnie who lived across the hall on the 16th floor? The DNA profile extracted from the rape kit never matched any profile in the databases. The man that Attorney Tendy had discovered had by that point either moved away or was unavailable for a sample. After decades, his trail had gone cold. Holding anyone accountable had become virtually impossible due to the statute of limitations. This is yet another bitter irony of the Ruiz case. While the system spent its resources keeping an innocent man in prison, the real rapist remained free. He could have committed new crimes. He could have been living an ordinary life while Rafael sat behind bars. And he never answered for what he did. After his exoneration, Rafael faced the question of compensation. In the state of New York, it's possible to file a lawsuit for damages resulting from wrongful conviction, but the process is long, complicated, and far from always successful. Whether Ruiz received any compensation from the state remained unknown at the time of his exoneration. He had no money, no job, no place of his own. The Innocence Project set up an Amazon wish list for him, where sympathetic people could buy him gift cards and basic necessities. A symbolic gesture of support for a man whose government had taken 25 years of his life. The story of Rafael Ruiz is a story about perseverance and faith. Faith in his own innocence that could not be broken by police brutality, an unjust verdict, or decades behind bars. Yes, he stumbled once, admitting guilt before the parole board so he could see his dying mother. But who would blame him for that? Which of us in the same situation would have done differently? It's also a story about people who refuse to give up, about attorney William Tendy, who worked for 3 years without pay because he believed in his client's innocence, about the lawyers at the Innocence Project, who spent years searching for the missing rape kit and ultimately got the case reopened, about his sister Maria, who stood by her brother all those years. Without these people, Rafael Ruiz would still be listed as a convicted rapist. But above all, it's a story about a system that is broken, about police who conduct suggestive identifications and use violence against detainees, about prosecutors who pursue convictions at any cost, about labs where evidence sits untested for decades, about parole boards that demand innocent people lie, about the trial penalty that punishes those who dare to defend themselves. Rafael Ruiz was 24 years old when he was arrested. He was 49 when he walked out of prison. He was around 60 when he was finally exonerated. He lost his youth, his career, his health, years that can never be returned. He emerged into a world that wasn't waiting for him, bearing a stigma that poisoned every day of his life. And when the truth finally prevailed, it brought relief. But it couldn't heal the wounds. Freedom without the ability to live is not quite freedom, and exoneration without compensation is not quite justice. The case of Rafael Ruiz is one of thousands like it in America. Thousands of innocent people are sitting in prison right now, waiting for someone to find a lost piece of evidence, run a DNA test, uncover a mistake. Some will be lucky, as Ruiz was, even if it took decades, but most will not. Most will die behind bars, never having seen the truth come to light. And as long as the system remains as it is, stories like the story of Rafael Ruiz will keep repeating again and again. Because the machinery of justice moves fast, when it needs to convict someone, and unbearably slow, when it needs to correct a mistake. 28 years, more than 10,000 days, every morning the same walls, every evening the same bars. You wake up knowing this day will be exactly like the last one, and the next, and the one a year from now. You count the days, then you stop counting, because it only makes things worse. The world outside the prison walls keeps moving forward, and you stand still. Youth slips away, health deteriorates, hope fades, and the whole time, you know one thing. You're innocent. You didn't kill anyone. You weren't at that place that evening. But nobody cares, because the detective who handled your case decided you were the one, and that was enough. This is the story of Lamont Byrd from Brooklyn, New York, a man who spent 28 years behind bars for a murder he didn't commit. He was convicted on the basis of fabricated witness testimony orchestrated by one of the most notorious detectives in the history of the New York City Police Department, a detective whose name has become synonymous with judicial abuse, Louis Scarcella. To understand how this was possible, you have to go back to Brooklyn in the mid-90s. You have to understand the world Lamont Byrd lived in and how that world worked. Brooklyn in the early 90s was a place soaked in fear. The crack epidemic that swept through New York in the 80s had reached devastating proportions by the start of the 90s. Neighborhoods like Brownsville, East New York, and Bedford-Stuyvesant had turned into war zones. In 1993, East New York alone recorded 126 homicides, a number that belongs more in dispatches from conflict zones than in the records of an American neighborhood. Street gangs carved up territories. Crack cocaine was sold on every corner, and gunfire was as routine as car horns. The police were overwhelmed. Murders piled up one after another, and every single one needed a case file, a suspect, a prosecution. The pressure on detectives was enormous. The brass wanted results, closed cases, arrests, convictions. Statistics defined careers, and in that atmosphere, where speed was valued over thoroughness and results over truth, a certain type of cop emerged. A detective for whom closing a case mattered more than a fair investigation. A a detective willing to cut corners, twist facts to fit a theory, and use any means necessary to secure a conviction. That detective was Louis Scarcella. Scarcella joined the New York City Police Department in 1974, and by the early 90s he had become one of the most prolific detectives in the homicide squad of the 73rd Precinct in Brownsville. His colleagues called him the Closer because he closed cases, one after another, at a staggering pace. Over his career, Scarcella investigated roughly 200 homicides. The higher-ups loved him. He received promotions, bonuses, commendations. He was elevated to first grade, the highest rank a detective can hold in the NYPD. But what the brass took for brilliant police work was actually a system of fabrication. Scarcella wasn't solving crimes. He was constructing prosecutions. His methods, which remained in the shadows for decades, included a whole arsenal of dirty tricks. The first was coerced confessions. Suspects were intimidated, beaten, held for hours in interrogation rooms without food, water, or a lawyer. People signed confessions without understanding what they were signing, or signed them under threat of violence. In several of Scarcella's cases, the texts of confessions from different suspects arrested for different murders contained identical phrasing as if they had been written by the same person, and that person was not the suspect. The second was fabricated witness testimony. Scarcella used the same witnesses across different cases. His star witness was Teresa Gomez, a drug-addicted woman who, according to Scarcella, supposedly happened to be a chance eyewitness to murder after murder. Gomez appeared as a witness in at least 6 different homicide cases investigated by Scarcella. The detective himself later admitted he gave her money and food. In one case, Gomez claimed she saw the shooting through a keyhole in a door. A later inspection revealed that door had no keyhole, but at trial, nobody checked. The third trick was manipulating lineups. Scarcella would put together photo arrays so that the person he wanted would visually stand out from the rest. He conducted identifications under conditions that made the outcome predictable. He pressured witnesses into pointing at a specific person. And the fourth was suppressing exculpatory evidence. If a witness changed their story, the prosecution never found out. If facts emerged pointing to a suspect's innocence, they vanished from the case file. It was into this man's hands that the murder case fell, the one that would send Lamont Byrd to prison. Lamont Byrd grew up in Brooklyn, in one of those neighborhoods where a young black man's life was defined by the geography of his birth. At the time of his arrest, he was 22 years old. He grew up in a family trying to stay afloat amid the crack epidemic eating away at their neighborhood. Brooklyn in the 90s, for people like him, was a minefield. One wrong step, one wrong acquaintance, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and your life was over. Lamont was no angel. In neighborhoods like that, there are no angels. But he wasn't a killer either. He lived the ordinary life of a young man from a rough neighborhood, scraping by with odd jobs, helping his mother, spending time with friends, making plans that rarely come true in those blocks, plans that were never meant to be. In 1995, there was a shooting in Brooklyn. A man was killed on the street in broad daylight, in one of those neighborhoods where it happens so often that the neighbors no longer flinched at the sound of gunfire. The police logged the homicide, and the case landed on the desk of Detective Louis Scarcella at the 73rd Precinct. The details of this case remain sparse to this day. Neither the victim's name nor the exact circumstances ever became widely known. At the time, murders like this were routine, one of more than 300 that year in Brooklyn alone. Cases were opened, hastily investigated, and closed, often with the first available suspect. And Scarcella did what he did best. He quickly found a candidate for the role of the guilty party. That candidate was Lamont Byrd. How exactly Scarcella zeroed in on Byrd is a question with no satisfying answer. In Scarcella's cases, this was a recurring pattern. The link between suspect and crime often hung by the thinnest thread. An anonymous tip, testimony from an unreliable witness, someone's vague finger pointing at a guy from the neighborhood. Scarcella wasn't searching for the truth. He was searching for someone to pin it on, and once he found that someone, he built a structure of testimony around them that confirmed a version he'd already chosen. In Byrd's case, the key role was played by witness testimony. Witnesses are the backbone of a criminal case when there's no physical evidence. No DNA, no fingerprints, no surveillance footage, just people who say they saw something. and Scarcella knew how to find those people, or more precisely, he knew how to make those people say what he needed them to say. The witnesses in Byrd's case identified him as the shooter. At trial, their testimony sounded convincing. They named him, described the events of that night, swore they saw Byrd commit the murder. But behind that confidence lay a very different story, a story about how a detective shapes the testimony he needs, how he meets with witnesses privately, off the record, how he explains to them what they saw, how he makes it clear what's expected of them, how he uses pressure, threats, or promises to get the result he wants. This was Scarcella's standard playbook. In the case of Jabbar Washington, convicted of a 1995 murder, prosecutors later concluded that Scarcella had intentionally and improperly tainted a witness identification. In the case of Shabaka Shakur, convicted of a double homicide, witnesses later recanted their testimony, saying Scarcella had pressured them. In the case of Derek Hamilton, Scarcella falsely testified at trial that the defendant's accomplice had given a statement against him, a statement that, as it turned out, never existed. Byrd's case fit into this system as just another piece on the conveyor belt. Witnesses gave the right testimony. The prosecution built its case on that testimony. Byrd's defense didn't have the resources for a serious fight. A public defender juggling dozens of cases at the same time simply couldn't conduct a proper investigation. The trial was quick. The jury heard the prosecution's witnesses, heard the confident testimony of people who swore they saw Byrd pull the trigger. The defense's version, that Byrd had nothing to do with the murder, sounded faint against the vivid witness accounts. The jury didn't deliberate long. Guilty. The sentence, 25 years to life. Lamont Byrd was 22 years old. His entire adult life, from youth to middle age, would be spent behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, for a murder he had absolutely nothing to do with. But on that day in the courtroom, none of that mattered. The machine of justice had done its work. Next, prison isn't just physical confinement. It's the slow destruction of a person from the inside, day after day, year after year, decade after decade. Byrd passed through several New York State correctional facilities, massive, overcrowded prisons where violence was part of daily life. The first years are the hardest. You still remember freedom, the smell of the street, the taste of a home-cooked meal, the voices of loved ones without the static of a prison phone. Byrd filed appeals on his own from his cell, studying law books in the prison library, drafting motions that came back time after time with the same answer: denied. He reached out to organizations that helped the wrongfully convicted. Responses came slowly, or not at all, and with every denial, it became clearer. The system has no interest in correcting its own mistakes. It has an interest in keeping the conviction intact. Byrd spent the entire second half of the 90s behind bars. He was in prison when the world crossed into a new millennium. He was in prison on September 11, 2001, when the Twin Towers collapsed just a few miles from where he grew up. He was in prison when smartphones appeared, when social media took off, when the world went digital. He was in prison when America elected its first black president. He was in prison when that president served 2 terms and left office. 28 years is an entire era. A man walks into prison young and walks out. If he walks out, aged, his health shattered, with no career, no connections, no understanding of the world he's returning to. All that time, Byrd never stopped proclaiming his innocence. That might sound like a minor detail, but in the American prison system, insisting on your innocence is an act of courage that borders on madness. Parole boards want to see remorse. They want to hear that the prisoner understands the gravity of what he did, that he's changed, that he's no longer a danger to society. An innocent person cannot feel remorse for something he didn't do. And every time he says, "I didn't do it," the board hears he's not remorseful and denies parole. Byrd faced that choice again and again. Lie and get a chance to walk out sooner. Tell the truth and stay behind bars. He chose the truth, time after time, year after year. It cost him years of freedom, but he couldn't bring himself to confess to something he never did. Meanwhile, beyond the prison walls, slowly, agonizingly slowly, a process was beginning to unfold that would ultimately change everything. The unraveling of Detective Louis Scarcella. The first cracks in Scarcella's reputation appeared in 2013. It started with the release of David Ranta, who had served 23 years for the murder of a rabbi. His case was reopened after a key witness admitted he had falsely implicated Ranta under pressure from Scarcella. That release caught the attention of the press, and the New York Times conducted its own investigation, uncovering disturbing patterns. The use of the same witness, Teresa Gomez, in multiple murder cases, confessions from suspects who later said they never made any statements, and an overall picture of systematic misconduct. The Kings County District Attorney's Office, covering Brooklyn, came under public pressure and launched a sweeping review of cases investigated by Scarcella. First 50, then more. A special unit was created, the Conviction Review Unit. What that unit discovered shocked even the most seasoned attorneys. Case after case, conviction after conviction, the same picture emerged. All the techniques Scarcella had honed over the years repeated from one case to the next. This was not an isolated instance of negligence. It was a system, a factory for producing convictions, and it had been running for decades. After Ranta came Derek Hamilton, 21 years in prison for a murder he had nothing to do with. Then Shabaka Shakur, 27 years for a double homicide whose witnesses later recanted. And those were just the first names. People who lost decades of their lives because of one detective who decided that closing a case was more important than finding the truth. By 2017, the number of people exonerated from Scarcella's cases had passed a dozen. Jabbar Washington, 21 years. Sundi Moses, 18 years. The list kept growing, and with every new name, it became more and more obvious. The scale of the disaster caused by one man was beyond imagination. But for Lamont Byrd, sitting in his cell, every one of those exonerations was both hope and torment. Hope because the system was finally starting to acknowledge its mistakes. Torment because his case hadn't come up for review yet. Every time he heard the news about another exoneration, he thought, maybe I'm next. And every time months passed with no word on his case, hope turned to despair. Reviewing Scarcella's 200 cases was a monumental undertaking. Each case required months of work, digging up archives, tracking down witnesses, if they were even still alive, re-examining evidence, running new forensic tests. The bureaucratic machine moves at a pace so slow that people age waiting for justice. For an innocent man behind bars, every day of delay is another stolen day of life. Byrd's case came to the attention of the Conviction Review Unit during the sweeping audit of Scarcella's work. Prosecutors began re-examining the case materials and discovered what had been hidden for decades. The witnesses who had so confidently identified Byrd as the shooter at trial turned out to be unreliable. One of them had his own legal troubles and was vulnerable to police pressure. Another, it emerged, could not have physically seen what he described. His location at the time of the shooting didn't match what he had claimed at trial. The identification procedure had been conducted improperly. The photo array was arranged so that Byrd stood out from the rest, and witnesses were apparently coached on whom to pick. What's more, Byrd's defense at the original trial never received materials that could have cast doubt on the reliability of the witnesses, so-called Brady materials that the prosecution is required by law to disclose. The deeper prosecutors dug, the clearer the picture became. The case against Lamont Byrd was built on sand. The foundation, the witness testimony, had been fabricated. Without that testimony, the case collapsed like a house of cards. There was no DNA evidence linking Byrd to the crime, no fingerprints, no confession from Byrd himself. There were only the words of people whom Detective Scarcella had somehow persuaded to say what he needed them to say. In 2023, nearly 3 decades after his arrest, the Kings County District Attorney's Office filed a motion to vacate Lamont Byrd's conviction. The judge granted the motion. All charges were dismissed. Nearly 3 decades. That's enough time for a child to be born, grow up, finish school, earn a degree, and start a career. Lamont Byrd spent that time in a prison cell. He walked into prison as a 22-year-old kid and walked out a man approaching 50 who didn't recognize the world around him. The day of release is a moment that defies words. The prison gates open and you take a step outside. Sunlight hits your eyes. The air smells different, not like bleach and concrete, but like trees, exhaust fumes, life. Your family wraps their arms around you and cries. Journalists' cameras flash. Lawyers shake your hand. And you stand in the middle of it all, unable to believe this day has come, that you're free. Byrd walked out of prison in 2023. He was 50 years old. Waiting for him were relatives, attorneys from the organization that had worked on his case, and reporters. According to those who were there, for the first few minutes, he just stood and looked at the sky. But freedom after that many years locked up isn't the freedom you dream about. It's freedom poisoned by loss. You're free, but your youth is gone. You're free, but you have no career, no work experience for the last 3 decades, no retirement savings, no credit history. You're free, but the world you've returned to is unrecognizable. When you went in, people were still using pagers. Now, everyone carries a computer in their pocket more powerful than anything that existed in '95. Lamont Byrd walked out a free man, knowing that all those years had been stolen. Ahead of him lay a long road of adjustment, finding a place to live, getting his documents in order, trying to find a job with no work history for the past 3 decades. Byrd filed a civil lawsuit against the city of New York, as many other Scarcella victims have done. But no amount of compensation can give back a stolen life. His years weren't taken by a natural disaster, an accident, or an illness. They were taken by a system that was supposed to protect him. A system in which one corrupt detective could decide people's fates by twisting facts to fit the outcome he wanted. A system in which prosecutors didn't check the police's work. A system in which jurors trusted witnesses without knowing those witnesses had been coached. A system in which appellate courts rubber-stamped denials without looking at the substance. And Scarcella? What happened to the man who destroyed the lives of dozens of people? Nothing. Louis Scarcella retired from the New York City Police Department. By the time his cases began falling apart one by one, he was already a civilian, a retiree shielded by qualified immunity and statutes of limitations. Despite the fact that as of 2025, at least 21 people have been exonerated from his cases, after a combined total of more than 420 years of imprisonment, Scarcella has never faced criminal charges. Not a single indictment, not a single day behind bars, not a single fine. What's more, he continues to collect his police pension. New York state law does not allow his pension to be revoked, regardless of how many lives he destroyed. The city and state have paid Scarcella's victims approximately $150 million in settlements, taxpayer money. $150 million for the mistakes of one man whom the system encouraged, promoted, and rewarded throughout his entire career. Scarcella still denies any wrongdoing. At every hearing, every deposition, every interview, he repeats the same thing. I worked honestly. I did my job. I never forced anyone to give false testimony. 21 exonerated people, more than 420 years behind bars, $150 million in settlements, and not a shred of remorse. But how could one detective fabricate cases for decades and nobody noticed? Because acknowledging the truth would have meant admitting that dozens of convictions were wrong, that the real killers were walking free, that the justice system in one of the largest cities on earth was broken. It was easier not to notice. The story of Lamont Byrd is not the story of one unlucky man. It's a story of systemic failure. 21 exonerated, those are only the ones whose convictions were overturned. But how many more people convicted by Scarcella are still sitting behind bars? How many died in prison without ever seeing justice? We don't know. And that might be the most terrifying part of all. Lamont Byrd got his freedom. That's more than many others received, but no compensation, no apology, no court ruling can give him back the stolen years. New York's justice system continues to review Scarcella's cases. 200 investigations, that's an enormous volume of work. And while lawyers draft motions and judges schedule hearings, someone is still sitting in a cell. Someone is still waiting. Lamont Byrd waited longer than anyone. He finally got his day. But at what cost? 28 years. More than 10,000 days. For a crime he didn't commit, because one detective decided it would be easier that way. Imagine waking up in a cramped cell every single day for 48 years. You know you're innocent. You tell everyone who will listen, but no one believes you. This is the story of Glynn Simmons, a man whose entire life was stolen by the justice system, setting a world record that no country on earth can be proud of. 48 years, and 26 days. That's exactly how long Glynn Simmons spent behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. When he was arrested, he was 22 years old. When he finally walked free, he was 70. While he sat in a cell, the world outside transformed beyond recognition. Personal computers, cell phones, and the internet were invented. The Soviet Union collapsed. Wars were fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. And through all of it, Glynn Simmons sat in his cell repeating the same words, "I didn't do this." To understand how something like this could happen, we need to go back to 1974 to the state of Oklahoma. America was going through turbulent times. The Watergate scandal had just forced Nixon to resign. Racial tension remained a painful reality, especially in the South. Oklahoma City, a modest town in the heart of what's known as the Bible Belt, went about its small-town life, where everyone knew everyone and outsiders were met with suspicion. Glynn Simmons was born and raised in Harvey, a small town in Louisiana just outside New Orleans. Among friends and acquaintances, he went by the nickname Nubs. He was a regular young guy from a working-class neighborhood, with no criminal record and no grand ambitions. In late 1974, Glynn moved to Oklahoma City looking for work. He stayed with his aunt, Dorothy Norris, and started settling into his new life. But over the Christmas holidays, he headed back home to Louisiana to visit friends and family. Nothing suggested disaster was coming. On December 30th, 1974, shortly before 9:30 in the evening, two armed men walked into a liquor store on the outskirts of Edmond, a quiet suburb of Oklahoma City. Two women were working behind the counter. 30-year-old Carolyn Sue Rogers, the store clerk, and Norma Hankins, her colleague on shift. There was also an 18-year-old customer in the store, Belinda Brown, who had come in with a fake ID to buy a bottle of tequila. It all happened in a matter of seconds. The robbers burst in, and one of them pointed a gun at the register. Carolyn Rogers instinctively reached for the phone to call the police. That move cost her her life. A shot rang out, and the bullet struck her in the head. Carolyn dropped dead. The second robber ordered Norma Hankins to open the register and grabbed about $1,000. Belinda Brown was also shot in the head, but by some miracle, she survived. The robbers vanished into the night, leaving behind one dead woman, one critically wounded, and one witness in a state of shock. The Edmond police launched their investigation immediately. A murder during a robbery in a quiet suburb sent shockwaves through the community. The pressure on detectives was enormous. The public demanded quick results. But from the very start, the investigation went off the rails. On January 2nd, 1975, 3 days after the robbery, police questioned Belinda Brown in the hospital where she was recovering from her injuries. The girl had suffered devastating trauma, a bullet to the head, shock, blood loss. When investigators asked if she'd be able to recall more details later, Belinda honestly said that over time, her memories would start to blur. That remark turned out to be prophetic, just not in the way police had hoped. On January 22nd, Belinda was shown a photo array of 21 pictures. She pointed to a photograph of Frederick Lee Brooks, saying she recognized one of the attackers. But the very next day, when she was put through a live lineup of 4 people, she couldn't identify him. Brooks provided an alibi, passed a polygraph test, and was completely cleared. You'd think this would have raised red flags for investigators. Their only witness, a woman who'd suffered a severe traumatic brain injury, couldn't reliably identify suspects. But the police kept pushing. Meanwhile, the investigation unexpectedly crossed paths with another case. On February 4th, 2 bodies were found on the outskirts of Oklahoma City. The next day, police arrested a man named Leonard Patterson, who confessed to those murders. Investigators discovered that on January 19th, Patterson had attended a party at the home of Dorothy Norris, Glynn Simmons' aunt. Police decided to run lineups using all the party guests, not because anyone was suspected in the liquor store robbery, but just to cast a wide net. On February 7th and 8th, Belinda Brown was brought in for a series of identifications, and this is where a story begins that would eventually unravel the entire prosecution. But that wouldn't happen for decades. During these lineups, Belinda pointed to several people. She identified 2 men who were neither Simmons nor Roberts. One she described as someone she hadn't gotten a good look at. Another as someone who, she thought, had said hello to her. According to records uncovered 20 years later, Belinda pointed to 4 different individuals across 8 identification procedures. But alongside these records, there existed a separate one-page document stating that Brown had also identified Simmons and 21-year-old Don Roberts. On February 8th, police arrested Glynn Simmons and Don Roberts, charging them with first-degree murder. From that moment on, the life of a 22-year-old kid from Louisiana became an endless nightmare. From his very first interrogation, Simmons maintained that he wasn't in Oklahoma on December 30th. He said he'd been in Harvey, Louisiana that day, hanging out with friends and shooting pool. Roberts also insisted on his innocence, claiming he'd been in Dallas visiting his father. But the police never bothered to verify their alibis. The investigation had a witness who pointed the finger at them, and that was enough. The trial of Glynn Simmons and Don Roberts began on June 4th, 1975, in the Oklahoma County District Court. The proceedings lasted just 2 days, 2 days that sealed the fate of 2 young men for the next half-century. The jury was entirely white. In mid-70s America, this wasn't unusual, especially in the South, but for 2 black defendants, it created an additional imbalance that's hard to overstate. The main, and essentially the only, prosecution witness was Belinda Brown. She confidently identified Roberts as the shooter and Simmons as his accomplice. But most critically, she testified under oath that she had never identified anyone other than Simmons and Roberts. That was a lie. We now know she pointed to 4 different people, but the jury didn't know that. The prosecution hid the police report documenting Belinda's contradictory identifications. This document, the key piece of evidence that could have changed the outcome, was buried from the defense. In legal terms, this is called a Brady violation, when the prosecution withholds evidence from the defense that could work in the defendant's favor. The second witness, Norma Hankins, who had stood face-to-face with the robbers, couldn't confidently identify the defendants, but her uncertainty was drowned out by the forcefulness of Brown's testimony. Simmons's defense was handled by a court-appointed attorney named Henry Floyd. Simmons testified about his alibi at trial. He explained that on December 30th, he'd been in Harvey, playing pool with 4 friends who could confirm it. But Floyd didn't call a single one of those alibi witnesses. Not one. 4 people were ready to confirm that Simmons physically could not have committed this crime, yet the defense attorney didn't lift a finger to bring them to court. Attorney Floyd declared in his closing statement, "Murder is a terrible crime, but we cannot allow one evil act to lead us into committing 2 additional injustices." Beautiful words, backed by not a single concrete action to defend his client. On June 5th, 1975, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty. Both Simmons and Roberts were convicted of first-degree murder. On July 24th, Judge Joe Cannon handed down the sentence, death for both defendants. Glynn Simmons was 22 years old when he was sent to death row. Picture that moment. You're 22, your whole life ahead of you, and now you're being led down a prison corridor to death row, where you'll wait for the state to execute you for something you didn't do. You scream about your innocence, but your voice is swallowed by the clang of steel doors. Simmons spent 2 years on death row, 2 years living in anticipation of execution. But in 1976, the United States Supreme Court issued a series of rulings establishing new standards for the death penalty, declaring automatic death sentences unconstitutional. On May 9, 1977, the sentences of Simmons and Roberts were commuted to life in prison. Death row gave way to a regular cell, but that was the only change for the better. And so began an endless prison odyssey, year after year, decade after decade. The world beyond the prison walls was changing at dizzying speed, while inside, time seemed to stand still. The same walls, the same routine, the same hopelessness. Simmons was held in several correctional facilities across Oklahoma. Prison life, for someone who knows he's innocent, is a special kind of torture. Every morning begins with the realization, you shouldn't be here. Every evening ends the same way. Glynn learned to survive in a system that wasn't built for the innocent. He worked in prison workshops, read books, and taught himself the law, plowing through dozens of legal volumes to understand the machinery that had ground him up. He wrote letters to lawyers, civil rights organizations, journalists, politicians. Most went unanswered, but Glynn Simmons never gave up. He filed appeals, wrote petitions, searched for any way to get his case reconsidered. In 1979, and again in 1982, Judge Cannon, the very same judge who had sentenced him to death, denied his motions for a new trial. The system that convicted an innocent man was in no rush to admit its mistakes. In 1981, something happened that, under different circumstances, could have bolstered Simmons' case. On December 23rd, the Oklahoma Supreme Court disbarred attorney Henry Floyd, the same defense lawyer who hadn't called a single alibi witness, for 23 violations of professional ethics. Among the charges, neglecting clients' interests and failing to return retainers. The man on whom Glynn Simmons' life depended turned out to be so incompetent that he was kicked out of the profession. But for Simmons, it changed nothing. The years rolled on. Simmons was repeatedly offered parole, but with one condition. He had to admit his guilt. For the system, this is standard procedure. Admit what you did, show remorse, and we'll consider letting you out. But Glynn Simmons refused every single time. He couldn't confess to something he hadn't done. That principle cost him decades of freedom. Every time the parole board heard him refuse to admit guilt, they denied his petition. He was turned down again and again, precisely because he was telling the truth. In 1995, there was an unexpected turn. Robert Mildfelt, the prosecutor who had tried Simmons' case back in '75, wrote a letter admitting that the case had always bothered him. He noted that the physical description of the attackers given by Belinda Brown differed significantly from Simmons' appearance. Mildfelt wrote, and I quote, "The verdict a week later could easily have been different. The prosecutor who had sent a man to death row acknowledged 20 years later that the evidence was shaky. But even that didn't help. In 1996, a private investigator uncovered that crucial police report on the identifications, the document the prosecution had hidden from the defense 20 years earlier. The report confirmed that Belinda Brown had initially pointed to other people, and that her testimony was contradictory and unreliable. This was the Brady violation evidence that could have turned the case around. In 1997, Simmons filed a new motion for a retrial, citing eyewitness misidentification and false testimony. He was denied again. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the denial. A federal habeas corpus petition was also rejected that same year. The system kept protecting itself. And Glynn Simmons kept sitting in his cell, year after year. He watched other inmates come and go. He watched young men grow old behind bars. He himself transformed from a young man into a middle-aged one, and then into an elderly one. His mother died without ever seeing him freed. The friends of his youth grew old. The world he'd known in 1974 ceased to exist. But sometimes justice finds unexpected allies. In 2003, KF4 television journalist Ali Meyer began investigating Simmons' case. She produced a series of reports questioning his guilt. Remarkably, Janice Smith, the sister of the murdered Carolyn Rogers, watched those reports and declared she believed in Simmons' innocence. The victim's sister sided with the convicted man. That speaks volumes. In 2008, Don Roberts, Simmons' co-defendant, was released on parole. He'd spent 33 years behind bars, but Simmons continued to be denied release because he refused to admit guilt. Another 10 years passed. In 2019, Oklahoma finally enacted an identification reform law, requiring blind procedures and documentation of witness confidence levels. The state itself acknowledged that the old methods were unreliable, but for Simmons, that acknowledgement came far too late. In 2021, the case received an unexpected boost. In September, the television show Reasonable Doubt dedicated an episode to Simmons' case. One of the participants was Liz Thornton, a juror from the original 1975 trial. When she learned that Belinda Brown had identified other people and that the prosecutor himself had doubted the defendant's guilt, she changed her mind. The show's hosts concluded that Simmons had been a victim of judicial overreach. That same year, the Norwood law firm took on Simmons' case with renewed energy. They brought in Dr. Kurt Carlson, a psychologist from Texas A&M University, specializing in the reliability of eyewitness testimony. His expert report, backed by dozens of scientific studies, demolished Belinda Brown's testimony. Carlson pointed to the witness's low level of confidence, the insufficient time to memorize faces, just a few seconds under extreme stress. the severe traumatic brain injury that inevitably affects the accuracy of memory, and the egregious violations in the identification procedure. On October 7, 2021, 14 alibi witnesses gave testimony or submitted sworn affidavits confirming that Simmons was in Harvey, Louisiana, in late December 1974. One of the witnesses, Anthony Williams, stated, "I was in shock because he wasn't in Oklahoma at that time. 14 people. Not 4, like at the original trial, the 4 who were never even called, but 14. And every single one of them said the same thing. Glynn Simmons was in Louisiana." In March 2022, attorneys Joseph Norwood and John Coyle filed a comprehensive motion for a new trial. They pointed out that the police had never verified Simmons' alibi, despite the fact that he'd been providing the names and contact information of his witnesses from day one. Investigators had simply ignored his words. And finally, the wheels of justice began to slowly turn in the right direction. On April 14, 2023, District Attorney Vicky Behenna filed a motion to vacate the conviction and order a new trial. Behenna, a former head of the Oklahoma Innocence Project, acknowledged that the concealed police identification report had led to an unfair trial and that the original prosecutor had harbored doubts about the defendant's guilt even after the verdict. On April 18th, a hearing was held before Judge Amy Palumbo. Alibi witnesses from Louisiana, Dr. Carlson, and former prosecutors all testified. Attorney Joseph Norwood told the judge, "Mr. Simmons had numerous opportunities to admit his guilt in order to gain a chance at parole. However, he was denied release time and again, largely because he refused to confess to something he did not do." On July 20th, 2023, Judge Palumbo ruled to vacate the conviction and ordered a new trial. Glynn Simmons was released on bail. After 48 years behind bars, he set foot on free ground for the first time. He told K4 reporters, "I'm free. There are no words to describe it. I served 48 years." On September 11th, District Attorney Behenna officially declined to retry the case. She announced that Belinda Brown was unavailable to participate in a retrial, the original detectives had died or were unavailable, and the prosecution acknowledged that the witness had identified alternative suspects. Her office concluded, "The state will not be able to meet its burden of proof and prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Simmons is responsible for this crime." On September 19th, Judge Palumbo dismissed the case with prejudice, and on December 19th, 2023, she issued a declaration of innocence. The judge wrote in her ruling, "This court finds by clear and convincing evidence that the crime for which Mr. Simmons was convicted, sentenced, and incarcerated, including any lesser-included offenses, was not committed by Mr. Simmons." The National Registry of Exonerations confirmed that Glynn Simmons became the longest-serving, wrongfully convicted person in the history of the United States, 48 years and 26 days, a world record in human suffering caused by a judicial error. But what does it mean to walk free at 70 after entering prison at 22? The world that greeted Glynn Simmons outside those prison walls was completely foreign to him. He didn't know how to use a smartphone. He didn't understand what the internet was. He'd never seen social media. The entire technological revolution that changed the life of every person on the planet had passed him by. He stepped into a world where everything was different, from the cars on the streets to the way people paid for things. And as if fate decided he hadn't suffered enough, after his release, Glynn Simmons was diagnosed with stage 4 liver cancer. A man who'd spent half a century in prison for someone else's crime was now fighting for his life in the most literal sense. He underwent chemotherapy and surgery to remove part of his liver. But even facing cancer, Simmons told reporters, "You won't hear a single complaint from me." The state of Oklahoma offered compensation for 48 years of wrongful imprisonment. The amount? $175,000. If you divide that by the number of days spent behind bars, more than 17,000, it works out to roughly $10 a day. $10 for a stolen day of life, for a day when you never saw the sunrise as a free man, for a day when you couldn't hug your mother, for a day when you aged within 4 walls, knowing you were innocent. Later, the city of Edmond, the very place where the robbery occurred, agreed to pay $7,150,000 as part of a civil lawsuit settlement. That's more, but you still can't put a dollar figure on 48 years of someone's life. You can't compensate for a youth that never happened, a career that never took off, a family he never built, children he never had. After his release, Glynn Simmons opened a food truck called Free Man's Food Truck. At 70 years old, after nearly half a century in prison, battling cancer, he started life over, from scratch, as if those 48 years had been ripped from the middle of his life, and now he had to piece himself back together. The story of Glynn Simmons isn't just the story of one wrongfully convicted man. It's an indictment of an entire system, a system where a single witness with a severe traumatic brain injury could send people to death row, a system where prosecutors hid evidence from the defense and got away with it for decades, a system where a court-appointed lawyer could fail to call a single alibi witness, and later be disbarred for professional incompetence. A system where an all-white jury tried black defendants in 1970s Oklahoma. A system where a man insisting on his innocence was punished for it with repeated parole denials. When Glynn Simmons was arrested, the president was Gerald Ford. When he was freed, it was Joe Biden. Between those two moments, 9 presidential administrations came and went. An entire generation was born, grew up, and grew old. In all that time, Glynn Simmons woke up in his cell and repeated, "I am innocent." And he was right. All those years, nearly half a century, he was telling the truth. And the system that was supposed to protect the innocent did everything it could to make sure his voice went unheard. When we talk about justice, we usually mean punishing the guilty. But true justice is, above all, protecting the innocent. And the story of Glynn Simmons shows what happens when the system forgets that. What happens is a catastrophe, a quiet, invisible catastrophe, stretched across 48 years. Imagine waking up every morning in a cell measuring 6 by 10 feet. Concrete walls, dim light, the clang of metal doors. You know you didn't commit the crime you're locked up for. You know it every single day, every one of 12,418 days, 34 years, an entire lifetime stolen for a crime you never committed. And the worst part, you can't prove your innocence because the system that convicted you doesn't want to listen. This isn't a movie plot. This is the real story of Benjamin Spencer, a man who was chewed up and spit out by the Texas justice system, stripped of everything, his youth, his freedom, his right to be a father and a husband, his right to simply live. His case is one of the most egregious examples of a wrongful conviction in American history. And today, we're going to tell you how it happened. Dallas, Texas, the mid-'80s. A city of oil money, skyscrapers, and scorching asphalt. But behind the facade of a thriving metropolis lay deep cracks, racial inequality, entire neighborhoods trapped in poverty, a war on drugs that turned black communities into zones of total police control. Dallas in the '80s was a city of two realities. White Dallas lived in suburban mansions with swimming pools and manicured lawns. Black Dallas lived in the rundown houses of the West Side, where going outside after dark was a gamble with your life. It was in this city, in this atmosphere of deep division, that Ben Spencer's story unfolded. Benjamin James Spencer was born in 1962 in Dallas. He grew up on the west side of the city, a neighborhood that in those years was predominantly African American, with high levels of poverty and crime. The streets where he played as a child were both home and a trap. Very few ever made it out. Ben was no angel. In his youth, he had minor run-ins with the law. Nothing serious, nothing violent. He worked, tried to break free from the cycle of poverty that had ensnared his parents and their parents before them. By 25, Ben was married to Deborah. He had a family, he had plans for the future. He dreamed of a stable life, a simple, ordinary life that most people take for granted. He had no way of knowing that all of it would be destroyed on one night in March. On March 22, 1987, a brutal crime took place in the West Dallas area. Jeffrey Young, a white businessman, 33 years old, was found dead next to his car on a dark street. His body showed multiple injuries. Young had been beaten and robbed. The medical examiner documented severe trauma incompatible with life. His wallet was gone, his watch torn from his wrist. By every indication, this was a robbery that ended in the victim's death. The crime scene was a poorly lit street in a neighborhood where police patrols ventured reluctantly. What was Jeffrey Young doing late at night in a high-crime area of West Dallas? The police never really answered that question. One theory was that he'd driven there on business, another, that he'd gotten lost while driving home from somewhere. There were also those who believed he'd come to buy drugs. But that version never went beyond rumor. Either way, Young ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time, and paid for it with his life. His wife and family were crushed by grief. The Dallas police promised to find the killer, and that promise, made under pressure from the public and the press, set off a chain of events that destroyed an innocent man's life. And this is where the truly terrifying part of the story begins. Not because the crime itself was horrific, it certainly was, but because the investigation that followed became a textbook example of how the justice system can destroy an innocent person's life. The Dallas police in the 80s were under enormous pressure. Crime rates were through the roof. Society demanded results, politicians demanded arrests, and in that atmosphere of relentless pressure, detectives often took the path of least resistance. They needed a suspect, and they found one. It didn't matter whether he was guilty or not. What mattered was closing the case, filing the report, making the numbers look good. In the murder of Jeffrey Young, the police found not a single piece of physical evidence pointing to any specific person. No fingerprints on the victim's body or car. No DNA evidence. Though, to be fair, DNA analysis technology in '87 was still in its infancy. No murder weapon, no stolen property recovered from anyone, no fabric fibers, no shoe prints, nothing. The investigation hit a dead end. Weeks passed with no results. The pressure kept building. And then the witnesses appeared. Two people, Gladys Oliver and Robert Mitchell, told police they had seen Ben Spencer attacking Jeffrey Young that night. Oliver claimed she had watched the scene from the window of her home, a home located a significant distance from the crime scene on a poorly lit street late in the evening. Mitchell said he'd been nearby and witnessed the attack with his own eyes. Both pointed to Spencer as the perpetrator. Both were emphatic in their statements. For the police, that was enough. Ben Spencer was arrested and charged with first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances during the commission of a robbery. He faced life in prison, or even the death penalty. The case was closed. The detectives could move on to the next one. In a modern courtroom, a case built entirely on the testimony of two witnesses, without a single piece of physical evidence, would most likely fall apart before the hearings even began. But this was 1988, Dallas, Texas, and the defendant was a black man from a poor neighborhood. The trial of Benjamin Spencer began in 1988. The proceedings were swift, indecently swift, given the severity of the charges. The prosecution built its entire case on the testimony of Gladys Oliver and Robert Mitchell. Both took the stand and pointed at Spencer. Both stated under oath that they had witnessed him committing the attack. The prosecutor presented their words as irrefutable proof. Two independent witnesses, unacquainted with each other, both identifying the same man. What more evidence could you need? Spencer's defense was weak. His attorney, appointed by the state, not chosen by Ben himself, failed to conduct a proper investigation. He didn't call witnesses who could have confirmed Spencer's alibi. He didn't hire a private investigator. He didn't adequately challenge the prosecution's witness testimony or draw the jury's attention to how flimsy the case really was. For the attorney, this was routine, just another black kid from West Dallas charged with a violent crime. The conveyor belt of justice rolled on without a hitch. The jury deliberated briefly. 12 people, among whom, it's worth noting, there was not a single African American, retired to the deliberation room and returned with a verdict astonishingly fast. The verdict, guilty. The sentence, life in prison. 35 years before the possibility of parole. But parole would mean admitting guilt, and Ben refused to admit to something he hadn't done. For him, accepting parole meant betraying himself. Ben Spencer was 25 years old. He was just beginning to live. And then a judge spoke the words that sent him to hell for decades. Ben stood in that courtroom unable to believe what was happening. He shouted that he was innocent, but his cries were drowned out by the clank of handcuffs and procedural formalities. His wife Deborah was in the courtroom. She was sobbing. She knew Ben couldn't have done it. He had been with her that night, but her testimony wasn't taken seriously. The defendant's wife? Who would believe her? That's how the system works. If you're close to the accused, your word is automatically discounted. But if you're a random witness pointing at a black man in '80s Dallas, Your word becomes a sentence. Ben Spencer ended up in a Texas state prison. The system didn't care that he was innocent. The system needed its statistics closed, case solved, criminal behind bars, justice served, on to the next one. But Ben didn't give up. From his very first day behind bars, he started fighting for his freedom. He wrote letters, dozens, hundreds of letters, to lawyers, civil rights organizations, journalists, politicians, anyone whose address he could find. He studied legal literature in the prison library, immersed himself in procedural law, searched for precedents. He essentially became his own attorney, because no one else was willing to take his case. Years passed. The 80s gave way to the 90s, the 90s to the 2000s. Ben grew old in a prison cell, and the world outside kept moving further and further away. Ben kept sitting behind concrete walls, kept writing letters, kept trying to prove what he had known from the very beginning. He was innocent. His hair turned gray. His face became lined with wrinkles. During those years, something critical happened, something that should have overturned his case from the start, but that the justice system stubbornly ignored. The prosecution witnesses began recanting their testimony. Gladys Oliver, one of the two witnesses whose testimony had put Ben behind bars, admitted she had lied. She stated that she hadn't seen the attack from her window, that the police had pressured her. Detectives came to her again and again, asked leading questions, showed her photographs, and made it unmistakably clear who she was supposed to identify, that she had essentially been coached on whom to point to. She signed a written recantation, a notarized document that stated in black and white, "I lied in court." This was in the early 2000s, about 15 years after the trial. Robert Mitchell, the second key witness, contradicted himself when re-interviewed. He changed his description of where exactly he had been standing, what he had seen, what time it happened, what the attacker was wearing. His version of events no longer matched what he had said in court. The discrepancies were so significant that any unbiased observer could see. His original testimony was, to put it mildly, unreliable, and more likely, fabricated. Now, imagine this situation. Both witnesses, the sole basis for the conviction, had essentially retracted their statements. Physical evidence never existed. Logic dictates that the case should be reviewed and Spencer should be freed. Any reasonable person would reach that conclusion in 5 minutes. But no, the Texas justice system doesn't work that way. In Texas, as in many other states, there exists a virtually insurmountable barrier to case reviews. Even when new evidence of innocence emerges, courts are extremely reluctant to overturn existing convictions. The principle of finality, the conclusiveness of a court decision, is valued more highly than justice itself. Admitting a mistake means admitting the system can be wrong, and admitting the system can be wrong means calling thousands of other convictions into question. It sounds absurd, but this is the reality of the American judicial system. Better to leave an innocent person in prison than to open Pandora's box. Spencer's appeals were rejected one after another. Courts found procedural grounds for denial, and each time the wording was different, but the essence was the same. No. Witness recantations? Not sufficient. Witnesses might have changed their minds for personal reasons. New witnesses ready to confirm his alibi? Their testimony could have been obtained earlier, so it doesn't qualify as new evidence in the legal sense. The bureaucratic machine worked flawlessly, in the sense that it flawlessly blocked every attempt to correct a monstrous error. But Ben kept fighting, and gradually, his case started attracting attention. In 2008, Ben Spencer's story caught the interest of reporters at the Dallas Morning News, one of the largest publications in Texas. They conducted their own investigation lasting several months and published a series of articles that cast serious doubt on the legitimacy of his conviction. The journalists found witnesses the police had never interviewed, people who had seen Ben somewhere else that night and could confirm it. They discovered that Spencer had an alibi his attorney hadn't bothered to verify. They found that the Dallas police during that period had systematically pressured witnesses in cases involving black suspects, and Spencer's case was far from the only one. The publications triggered a public outcry. People began asking uncomfortable questions. How could a man be sentenced to life without a single piece of physical evidence? Why didn't the witness recantations lead to a case review? What was going on with the justice system in Texas? Spencer's case came to the attention of Centurion Ministries, a non-profit advocacy organization specializing in defending people convicted of crimes they didn't commit. The organization took on Spencer's case and began gathering evidence of his innocence with professional thoroughness. At the same time, professional attorneys got involved, no longer state-appointed, but experienced lawyers specializing in wrongful conviction cases. The attorneys did monumental work. They re-interviewed every witness. They found people who had seen Ben elsewhere on the night of the murder and were ready to testify to it. They documented the police pressure on witnesses. They assembled expert opinions questioning whether Oliver could have seen anything at all from her window in the dark at that distance. In 2013, a moment arrived that seemed like it should have put this case to rest once and for all. A Dallas County District Judge, Judge Rick Magnus, held a hearing on Spencer's case. He listened to all the defense arguments, reviewed all the new evidence, and issued an unequivocal finding. Ben Spencer is innocent. The judge recommended immediate release. There were tears of joy in the courtroom. Ben's family embraced. Attorneys shook hands. It seemed like the nightmare was finally over. But it wasn't. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, the state's highest criminal court, rejected Judge Magnus's recommendation. The court stated that despite the witness recantations and the absence of physical evidence, the grounds for overturning the conviction were insufficient. This decision was met with a wave of outrage, not only from civil rights advocates but from the legal community at large. Many lawyers, even those who typically supported a tough stance on criminal justice, called the decision unjust. Ben Spencer learned of the rejection in his cell. He was already in his 50s. He had spent more than 25 years in prison. The hope that had ignited after Judge Magnus's ruling was crushed by a single bureaucratic order. But even after this blow, Ben didn't break. He kept fighting. Another 5 years passed. Spencer's case had become a symbol of injustice in the Texas judicial system. Newspapers across the country wrote about it. Legal conferences dissected it. Law students studied it as an example of systemic failure. But Ben was still behind bars. In 2019, another turning point came. The new Dallas County District Attorney, John Cruzo, took office with a promise to reform the system and review questionable cases from years past. Cruzo established a special unit for case reviews, the Conviction Integrity Unit, and Spencer's case was among the first in line. Prosecutors from the new unit re-examined all the case materials, and they reached the same conclusion that the attorneys, journalists, and Judge Magnus had already reached. Ben Spencer did not commit this crime. Evidence of his guilt had never existed. But even after this, the release process dragged on for another 2 years. Bureaucracy, procedures, formalities, all of it continued to hold an innocent man in a cage. The Texas judicial system, which can convict a person to life in prison in a matter of days, proved incapable of correcting its own mistake within a reasonable time frame. And then, finally, the day came. On March 22, 2021, exactly 34 years to the day after Jeffrey Young's murder, Benjamin Spencer walked free. He was 58 years old. The moment of his release was captured on camera. Ben walked out of the courthouse in a suit his attorneys had brought him. His own clothes had long since been replaced by a prison uniform. He squinted in the sunlight, not because the sun was especially bright, but because he had forgotten what an open sky without bars looked like. He stopped on the courthouse steps and just stood there, breathing in the air of freedom. And then he embraced his wife, Deborah, the same Deborah who had waited for him all that time. Deborah Spencer is a separate story of courage and devotion that deserves its own telling. She never once believed in her husband's guilt. She visited him every single week, all those years, every week without exception. 1,700 visits. Every time, security screening, metal detectors, limited time, conversations through glass. She wrote letters to officials, journalists, attorneys, anyone who might help. She raised their children alone, working multiple jobs to make ends meet. She refused to accept injustice as a fact of life. When friends and relatives told her, let it go, start over, get a divorce, she answered, no. My husband is innocent, and I will wait. When Ben walked out of that courthouse and embraced her, they both wept, a lifetime apart. And finally, they were together again. But What does freedom mean for a man who spent more than half his life behind bars? Ben entered prison in 1987. There was no internet back then, no cell phones, no social media. The Berlin Wall was still standing. The Soviet Union still existed. People listened to music on cassette tapes. And now he stepped into the world of 2021, a world of pandemics, smartphones, Zoom calls, and electric cars. A world changed beyond recognition. Ben described his first days of freedom as overwhelming. Simple things, choosing what to have for lunch, deciding where to go, opening a door and walking outside without permission, walking into a store and seeing dozens of types of coffee on a shelf. All of it was brand new. For decades, every decision had been made for him. When to wake up, when to eat, when to sleep, where to go, what to wear, and suddenly, complete freedom of choice. It was both wonderful and terrifying. The world beyond the prison walls had become louder, faster, brighter, and it made his head spin. But the joy of freedom was poisoned by the bitterness of lost time. 34 years isn't just a number. It's his children's childhood that he missed. First steps, first words, school performances, graduation ceremonies, all of it happened without him. It's a career he never built. It's the health he lost in prison conditions. It's a youth that passed behind bars. It's thousands of sunrises he greeted in a cell instead of at home, with his family. It's friends who grew old and passed away. It's a life that can never be lived again. After his release, Ben Spencer faced a harsh reality. The state of Texas was in no hurry to compensate him for stolen decades. Although Texas has a law providing compensation for the wrongfully convicted, the process of actually receiving that compensation is a bureaucratic marathon in itself, requiring months and years. Ben filed a claim for compensation, which by law amounts to $80,000 for each year of wrongful imprisonment. For 34 years, that comes to roughly $2,700,000. The sum might sound significant, but divided across decades of stolen life, and it seems pitiful. $80,000 for a year in a cage, $219 for a day of stolen freedom. What's the price of a day when you could have hugged your child, but instead sat in a cell? Ben Spencer's case is not an isolated incident. According to the National Registry of Exonerations, more than 3,000 cases of exoneration have been documented in the United States. People previously convicted of serious crimes. Texas consistently ranks among the top 3 states with the highest number of such errors. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, the victims are black men. Spencer's case brought together all the typical factors of a wrongful conviction: false witness testimony, inadequate defense, pressure on police, and racial bias. Oliver admitted she lied. Mitchell's testimony fell apart under re-examination. Based on these words alone, a man lost decades of his life. If Ben had had the money for a good attorney, his story might have turned out very differently. But in America, the quality of justice depends directly on the size of your wallet. And that is perhaps the most frightening truth about the system. After his release, Ben Spencer didn't harbor resentment toward the world. Instead, he became a voice for those still languishing in prisons for crimes they never committed. He spoke publicly, telling his story to audiences of hundreds. He met with lawmakers, calling for reform of the criminal justice system. He became a living reminder of the price people pay for the system's mistakes. In interviews after his release, Ben said remarkable things. He said he hadn't become bitter, that prison didn't break his spirit, though it tried every single day, that he forgives those who did this to him, not for their sake, but for his own, because hatred and bitterness destroy you from within, and he had already lost enough. He couldn't afford to lose his soul too. These words, coming from a man who had 34 years of his life taken away, sound almost unbelievable, but in them lies the very essence of Ben Spencer, a man the system tried to destroy but couldn't. Ben also spoke about those he left behind in prison, about people whose names nobody knows. He had attorneys, journalists, advocacy organizations, a judge who declared him innocent, and a prosecutor's office that ultimately acknowledged the mistake. And even with all of that, it took him decades to walk free. Now, imagine those who have none of it, those sitting in prison without hope, without attention, without a voice, without a wife who waits for decades, without journalists who dig up the truth. How many are there? We don't know. And that not knowing, that's part of the problem too. Ben Spencer today is a free man. He lives in Dallas, near the very places where his life was destroyed. He's relearning how to be part of a world that moved on without him, and every day of freedom is not something he takes for granted. It's a right he fought for and won. But every morning when he wakes up, those years live in his memory. The years when he knew the truth, but the world didn't believe him. Years that no one will ever give back to him. No amount of money, no apologies will return Ben Spencer's youth. And although Ben found the strength to forgive, forgetting is impossible. 34 years, 12,418 days. That's how long it took for the truth to finally prevail. A system capable of taking an innocent person's entire life. That's a system that threatens every single one of us. Today it was Ben. Tomorrow it could be anyone.